In this lesson, we'll look at data storage. In Android, there are a few options for handling data storage. The most fundamental choice is whether to store data locally, remotely, or both. Then once that is determined, the method of storage has to be chosen. The next several lessons will demonstrate various options. Our first is using a local data store. Storing data locally has the obvious advantage of allowing an application to work even when it is not connected to any network or the internet. The disadvantage is that it makes it really difficult to share data with anyone or anything else. Local data access is quicker, however, so you might want to use it in conjunction with remote data access, essentially working locally and then syncing remotely. Syncing brings its own challenges, of course, so you may want to consider that as well. SQLite is the default Android database. In this example, we'll access it using a SQLite Open Helper. The helper is an Android-specific class. Here is our SQLite Open Helper. And the first thing we need to provide is a database name. SQLite is a file-based database, so this actually turns out to be a file right on the system. Then in the onCreate, in this case we're going to drop any existing tables and then recreate them. And one of the things to note is that the only way to create a SQLite database is actually in code. There aren't any visual tools on the device, and there's no way to deploy it within the tools in Visual Studio. So essentially you create it in code. And this is one of those things where you have to decide whether the database exists, if it's the right version, and whether you want to create it, drop tables in it, and how you want to handle updates. So that becomes an interesting thing to consider when you're creating your application. In our case, we're just going to drop our table and create our table every single time that this helper is created. Then we have a class called DAL for Data Access Layer, and it's going to have a SQL helper. And when we create the DAL, we're going to run the SQL helper on create. And then we have a couple of other methods that we're going to have. We're going to have an add user method, which simply will pass in a username, password, and display name. And we'll create a content values object. A content values object is essentially a dictionary with keys and values. So we'll put in our username, password, and display name. And then our SQL helper class will use the writable database to insert the values into the users table. Then we have another helper class called login user, and it returns a bool for if we got a good user and password. And we pass in a username and a password. And using our SQL helper class, we query the users table, looking for a username equal to the parameter. We do this using the SQL helper, a readable database, and run the query method. That will give us a table cursor. So we've got a read-only cursor, similar to a data reader for .NET. So we're going to loop through this cursor and looking for the matching password for that particular username. It would be fairly unusual for a system to be designed to have multiple records for a single username, but for example purposes, this works fine. So we loop through the records, and we get a password variable using our table cursor, and we get a string variable from the column with index 2, or the third column. So if you remember, we had an ID, a username, and a password when we created the table. If we find a matching password, we return true. If we haven't returned in the end, we'll return false, which means that was a failed login. Our main form is just a very basic username password login form. And finally, we get to our activity code. And in our activity, we're going to load our database first thing. We'll create a new DAL. We'll add a couple of users. And then on the button click, we'll just check the login user off of the DAL, passing in the username text and the password text. If it was good, we'll just use a little toast message that says the login was accepted. If it's not good, we'll say it's failed. So at this level of the activity, using the DAL is a really easy, clear way of doing it. So we have that separation between the data layer and the UI activity layer. So we'll run this just to make sure we got it right. And I will type in a username. And I will type in a correct password, hopefully. And there's our toast message saying the login was accepted. I'll make that password incorrect. And our login has failed. So we did get it right. So that's our first data access application. As I mentioned before, the SQLite Open Helper is an Android-specific class. It's a nice way of doing data access for Android, but if you have any intention of making this cross-platform to iOS, which is one of the promises of the Mono framework, you might consider doing it in a .NET manner. In the next lesson, we'll show how to access the local data with a cross-platform approach using standard .NET classes.